Hello, and welcome to the next lesson in your UAS 109 Crew Resource Management course. This is video 2, the nature of CRM and Situational Awareness. The first thing we'll go over is the nature of Crew Resource Management, otherwise or better known often as CRM. Let's talk about the evolution and the application of Crew Resource Management. Originally, CRM was often referred to as cockpit resource management, and emphasis was placed on the pilot as the commander over the crew, if there was one, and over the crew team. So, in essence, as aviation began, emphasis was often placed on command and control type management situations, not unlike business, and the pilot was chosen as the commander because they were the most experienced in aviation at the time. And this came from what was known as the single pilot tradition in aviation. So think of that historical image of the pilot, single, stalwart, the adventurer, in an open cockpit, white scarf trailing in the wind, this person who was willing to take risks to go into this new profession of aviation, maybe not unlike some of you in the drone industry. It's the new era of aviation. So we often have this image in our head, Amelia Earhart, flying, disappearing, taking those kinds of chances, Charles Lindbergh. The historical books are full of people, Orville and Wilbur Wright, going up one at a time, taking those chances. So this image was hard to break in aviation. And often the stereotype was kind of lived up to because the pilot's personality, or the person who went into this industry, really was someone independent-minded, probably very macho, very brave, but also was calm under pressure. They had that ability to react quickly, but they were the only one on the plane at the same time. But this kind of culture kind of went on from the beginning of aviation almost up until the 1970s, probably a little earlier as the evolution of the jet engine came about. But really, aviation started to think about this in 1970. So there was an element of truth and a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, as the sociologists would say, where those who loved danger went into the dangerous profession, especially in the earliest years of aviation. But as the aircraft become more complex, a CoPilot was introduced to the cockpit to reduce human error and decrease the single pilot workload. But there was still that independence. They weren't really a team. They were there, and if the pilot went down, then the CoPilot took over. But the CoPilot was a backup. So training was centered on pilots because they were in charge. If we were going to put safety training or training in understanding dangers, risks, training on the aircraft, that was all done through the pilot. And then think about the capstone test of manned aviation, that test that really makes you a pilot, and it still exists today, the notion of the solo flight. And that still is there. And there was of course, the cultural thing of you don't correct the captain, you don't correct the pilot, you don't correct the commander. He's in charge. And, much like many other things in society, it was males dominated at the beginning. So remember that the aviation community has operated with crews composed of able, well-trained individuals that operate complicated aircraft in a complex environment without incident. So what we've seen is this emergence of crews, but we've also seen, even coming out of this kind of macho culture, we've seen an industry that has been very successful in mitigating risks and keeping aviation safety at the forefront. What's came to light over the years of aviation, the last 100 years, and especially 30 years of data between 1959 and 1989, was that the casual flight crew actions contributed to human error in almost 70% of worldwide aviation accidents. So that untrained, that kind of, and think of almost like, You think of the 1950s stewardess. It wasn't a person trained in aviation as much as they were trained in getting you a cocktail. So that person wasn't helpful in alerting the pilot. And this was probably caused, in essence, through the research, a lot of the incidents and accidents that happen. So this identification of those crew issues as central to high proportion of accidents and incidents was the factor in the realization that you needed to train that crew and you needed to enhance that single pilot education simultaneously. So crews represent a group interaction and dynamics. That changes it from that solo pilot. Training an individual is much different than understanding group cohesion, group dynamics, and the interaction, and especially the interaction in relation to the safety procedures in aviation. But this became really evident through the research. So let's talk about this group process and performance in life, and not only in aviation. The study of group dynamics historically is really the purview of sociologists and social psychologists, and those two groups will argue about which one founded studying group dynamics first. I won't get into that argument here. But aviators begin to look at these phenomena. They had to go back and think about, well, what are the research? What is it about group dynamics that these other disciplines have found? And then a model of flight crew performance in looking at what existed in knowledge could emerge. And it emphasized three concepts: input factors, group process factors, and output factors. So these are the three factors of flight crew performance. So let's start with the end. Let's start with the outcome factors. These are usually easily recognized and quantified. Safety is the paramount goal of the outcome factors. Mission completion is the goal. And compliance, or successful compliance, or appropriate adherence to the regulatory requirement. These are the outcomes that could be measured. Outcomes are used to measure the impact of these training initiatives then. So we can't really use accidents as the measure because that's what we had before. So we had to come up with other outcomes. So the idea is, if we increase safety, if we can successfully complete more missions, and we comply with the regulations, they're often designed around safety, then the accidents are kind of the other outcomes. So the outcome factors of the training are to improve these three components so that accidents diminish, or at least accidents by human error diminish. The input factors, so let's go back and then we'll go to the middle with the most complicated. The input factors, they tend to be more qualitative into the group process. So individual factors. So let's think of the individual. What can we enhance in the individual? Their knowledge, their skills. We can align teams based on personalities. There are personalities that can cause detrimental or catastrophic failures. What's the motivation of the individual? And let's look at their physical and emotional states. So are they physically healthy, and are they mentally healthy at the same time, or emotionally healthy? Another input factor might be group factors. So is the group cohesive? Is it effective? Or is it a divisive group? Is it a rancorous group? And or is it ineffective dependent on the makeup of the individuals? And what are the team dynamics or the group dynamics? Organizational factors, so the large scale. So think in the early days of crew resource management, this was the airlines, if you will. But we've noted over time that it can be a much smaller organization. So it doesn't have to be United or American Airlines. It could be Warren County Community College's UAS program. What's the culture that's set up? What is the tone that is set in that organization? What are their norms? What's normal for them? What do people do without even being told? What's the organizational resources? Resources matter too. I mean, in that underpaid staff can really impact group cohesion. Evaluation. What's the evaluative process? And what are the policies and procedures of the organization? So here you see things in your own studies to date, like CONOPS, operations manuals, standard operating procedures, safety management systems. All these would be the organizational level. So there are other factors in the input. What are the regulatory factors? Regulations, the FAA regulations. You're very familiar with that from your Part 107 test. What are the training requirements? Okay, and you know this, so that would be you have to go back and take your Part 107 recurrence test every 2 years. And what are the evaluation standards for the input factor? So in manned aviation, there's constant checkup, constant evaluation, but think about the UAS operations isn't following quite that same, because you're looking at a pencil and paper test every 2 years as evaluative standards. Unless an organization puts something in, but from a regulatory standpoint, that's where we stand. And then you have to consider another input factor, the environmental factor, and that could be the aircraft, the equipment, the weather, air traffic control, anything outside the purview you have to prepare yourself and train for. So the one in the middle and the most complicated and the least studied and the least understood is group processes of the 3 factors of crew performance. And almost here I have to ask you questions to kind of illustrate the point, because as the least studied and least understood, we're forming this knowledge as we go along, although we can take some things from business and industry that can help us. So we might ask, how do teams form? And if we understand that, can we create crews into functional, high-performing teams? How is work delegated and managed in the group process? How is it when this group comes together? Is it a command and control? Is it a flattened organization? Are people empowered? So all of these things kind of matter too. How does the group go from abstract to concrete in decision making? So how do you move from the abstract or the vague to knowing what the right decision is? Especially in a group. You know, and a lot of times, and think about large commercial aviation accidents, and you'll be looking at a number of them over the course. So you understand what can happen in the sky with people, but also when you're putting a large drone in the sky and the people are on the ground, the group interaction doesn't go away. So what is it that can bring us to instant decision making where everyone can kind of agree and people are communicating? So how do you go from that as a concept abstractly to a concrete decision making? How does stress, fatigue, how do emergencies and personal experience influence group dynamics? If one person's fatigued, another one's stressed, and then an emergency occurs and nobody's experienced, so you can look at all of these elements. And then probably most importantly, what is the role of leadership and how is leadership defined? And we kind of talked about that before. Is it command and control? Is it empowerment? Is it democratic? Is it a dictatorship? How is the leader formed, and how does that impact with the group dynamics? People react to different kinds of leadership styles. Some people actually, I know it's an unpopular thought, some people like to be told what to do. In a command and control structure, they're very comfortable there, and others will rebel against that. So I guess this is the way of saying probably the most complicated thing in crew performance are the people themselves. So we look at this, and at the individual level, we have aptitude and intelligence, personalities and motivations, knowledge and training, their physical condition, their emotional state, which all kind of goes into this group process. So people bring what they bring. The group also brings, as it forms, what's its composition? How's it structured? What's the climate of the group? What are the normative patterns of this group? What's normal in the group behavior? And we could talk about teaming here too. And how does that impact group process? At the organizational, what's the culture, the norms, the resources, the scheduling, the evaluation, the procedures, the policies, and how does that all impact group process or the group working together? The regulations, the training requirements, the evaluation standards, the facilities, the air traffic control, everything in there. How does that impact group process? And then what's the aircraft condition, the aircraft's equipment, the weather, the physical, the operating environment? What's all that mean? And that too falls into that group process. So you can see that that's tough. Think about all those variables on the far left-hand side. So if you were trying to do research, it would be hard to study all that at once, even if you were able to numerically capture all these and try to run a complex statistic to understand this, like a regression analysis. You would get so much what's known as multicollinearity or overlap that it would be hard to find anything on the left-hand side that's more important. So when you're trying to affect all those things on the left-hand side, it can become very difficult in developing a training so that you can manage your crew and bring them up to speed. So this is a more complex, but it's the idea of input, group performance, and then the outputs. So on the far left-hand side are the inputs, and we talked about these are the input factors: individual aptitudes, physical, crew composition, organizational factors, all those things then go into that kind of crew and mission performance, or that group dynamic. So how does the crew form? How does the team form? You know, there's a when we'll go over this later, storming, forming, norming of people coming together. That takes time. And if we're moving different crew members in and out constantly, think of commercial aviation. It's often hard to kind of reform a team in minutes. And how's that crew managed? What's the aircraft flight control? Who's in charge? How do you improve communication skills? We talked about this a little bit in the last video. How do you improve or train on the decision process or decision making? Situational awareness. How do you ensure that everyone in that crew is aware of situational awareness and is cognizant of their loss of situational awareness at any time? Not just the pilot, but other members who might be distracted and not notice something going outside that the pilot couldn't even see. And what are the operating procedures? And as that all comes together, and it's kind of a feedback loop, and you'll notice all of the arrows are kind of going in each direction simultaneously, because this is all a symbiotic, or what we might call synchronicity, in trying to achieve these outcomes. And what are the outcomes? Well, there's the crew and mission performance outcomes. So the crew has to act safely and have efficiency and fulfill that mission. And then the individual brings their attitudes and morale, but the morale can also come from the organization. So remember, I often say this when I used to teach strategic planning and leadership. Morale filters from the top, but it's impossible for the people at the top to make individuals happy. So you're stuck in that complex environment as an outcome too at the same time. So as you can see, the point of what I'm trying to make here is creating a crew resource management system with appropriate training faces a myriad of complexity from the first day. So in many ways you can study it, and there's a lot of other literature and a lot of other disciplines you can bring in here to improve these training regimens. But in some ways there's a lot of unknown that exists as well because of the complexity. So let's talk about expanding and elaborating group process factors. So there was further research that expanded the conceptual understanding of group process, and it added two categories: interpersonal and cognitive functions as one category, and machine interface tasks. So what we had is we had the interpersonal in the crew and what they brought to the table, the cognitive, but then they had to interact with a machine. So we know this because you're training in UAS. You're familiar with this, but if you've never flown a commercial jet airline, there's become much more automation or autonomy in that. So the human interaction with the machine, it's kind of the machine becomes a part of the crew or the team as well, in an abstract kind of way. So what do? We see briefings, inquiry, assertion, self-critique, communications, and decisions. Those are the communications and decision tasks that have been identified to help with the training and help the crew understand what's going on. There's the team formation and management skills. That's leadership, tasks, group climate. And both of those go into the interpersonal or cognitive functions. So you can kind of see communication, decision-making, that can self-critique. These kinds of things can be the interpersonal, and the team forming, the leadership, or rather they can be the cognitive, the briefings, the leadership, that's the interpersonal or the teaming. So those are the functions that go into an integrated crew resource management. Training for preparation, planning for emergencies, planning for contingencies, vigilance, workload distribution, tasks, distraction avoidance. This all goes into situation awareness and workload management tasks. Power control, flight control, navigation, they go into the aircraft control tasks. Checklists, air traffic control, systems operations and abnormal operations go into procedures. And these have to be in machine interface. Now this I think in many ways this chart works very well for UAS operations because it's constant machine interface with our crews because the machine is the only thing in the sky and we are on the ground. So we are interacting over radio frequencies. So this becomes compelling for us as we try to develop our own method of understanding crew resource management in the world of unmanned aircraft systems. So I'm going to leave this up for about 10 more seconds. I want you to, without me talking, just kind of take a look at the chart. You can always press pause as well if you need more time. So, as you can see the complexity of it all, then comes the evolution of the actual trying to train a crew for all these things simultaneously, which can be difficult. So since the 1970s, CRM has gone through numerous evolutionary steps. Part of the evolution is moving beyond the cockpit to the other organizational areas. So if you think about the last time you flew on a commercial airline, and you think about the world after 9/11, the cockpit's locked and closed. Even when the pilot has to use the facilities, they have to shut down the whole front of the plane, put the cart in front of there. So there's a lot more to being a flight attendant than there was to being a stewardess, if you will. So, we often think of, well, they changed that name because much the way we don't call them secretaries, we call them administrative assistants or sometimes just assistants. But it's not only a kind of gender thing. It's also a complexity thing. What a flight attendant does today and is responsible for, someone who would have been called a stewardess in the 50s, if you will, would have never even conceived they'd be doing as part of their operations. Now, they may have been doing things depending on the individual pilot because, remember, the pilot was in command. So we had to bring all this together. We had to evolve the profession. And all that led to greater risk mitigation for increased safety. So think about how the world has evolved and the cultural conceptualization of the world at the same time we've gone through this. And I think we see why were we able to keep the airspace safe. The FAA is going to tell you the regulations. I'm going to tell you the emergence of complexity in the aircraft was mirrored with complexity in our society. It came together in a congruent way with some really smart people in the 70s who started to realize how the world was changing and began training for the future. So I think a lot of those researchers deserve a great deal of the credit. So here are some of the key, speaking of the research, crew research management findings over the years. Well-trained crew members find CRM to be highly effective. That's one of the things that research has shown. People who go through it, believe in it, find it to be very effective, and the outcomes have shown it to be effective. Positive changes in crew attitudes happen when they're trained. And you can think about this. Frustration and bad attitude comes when you don't know what you're doing. When you feel confident and you know what you're doing and you feel well-trained, that's going to improve your attitude. If you know how to get along with your difficult personality on your crew and team and it can be mitigated and managed, it's going to improve everybody's attitude and morale. So that's not a surprising finding, but an important one. Management must determine the effectiveness of CRM training protocols. So it's not up to someone above the crew has to kind of study it. So has to have that bird's eye view. It's not that the crew itself wouldn't be involved in understanding the effectiveness of the protocols, but management has to be the decision outside of the operation. Without routine training, the effect of CRM training diminishes. So that's a kind of an important one. This has to be an ongoing thing. So as you go out, either be on a crew, work in management in UAS, work in some component of UAS, start your own business. Remember that if you don't continuously train or continuously educate yourself, what you've done in the past just basically diminishes and it evaporates from your perspective, if you will. And then another important finding was there are a small number of participants who will reject this outright. There's still the ones that want to throw the white scarf off, fly into the sunset, and set records. And if you think of what we've done at Warren over the years, we started very small. We started very slow. We're evolving now. But even when we went to say, let's do something no one else has done in aviation, no one else at a community college, let's be the first to get the waiver to fly drones over people. the emphasis is on safety, on crew, on your education as students. That's first, so that we just don't run out there and do things without proper mitigations, without real thoughtful inputs from everyone into the operations, into the mission. And that's important. So remember, don't be the person who runs out there and doesn't need training and doesn't need to constantly ask questions of yourself. Culture in CRM. This is kind of really important. Without an organizational culture that supports and promotes crew resource management, the positive effects will not even be experienced, even with training. So if people, and if you've been involved in complex organizations, you may have seen this in other training. If people don't take the training seriously, if it's not part of the culture, if you don't say, hey, risk mitigation and safety are our culture, it's extremely important here. It's the number one thing we're thinking about because we don't want to hurt anyone. Then the crew resource training becomes effective because everybody wants to know, how can I be more effective at safety and risk management? How can I do this well? How can I be the best pilot I can be? So it's the culture that sets the tone. And then in that regard, in a lot of ways, leadership matters too. It is very, very difficult to change culture. Next, we're going to look at the concept of situational awareness. It's probably one of the most important elements of the crew resource management, or of the crew, maintaining their situational awareness constantly. So the next time you're on a commercial aviation and the flight crew seems a little distracted, that may not be the time to ask for another bag of peanuts. Let's talk about some of the behavioral examples of situational awareness. You need to avoid tunnel vision and be aware of your own personal stress. You need to actively monitor the weather, aircraft systems, instruments, air traffic control. You need to prepare and be prepared and plan for contingencies. You need to verbally ensure pilot and the crew are aware of plans and all things that are going on, so the communication. You need to make sure that workload distribution is fair, equitable, makes sense, and is clearly communicated. You need to ensure secondary tasks are prioritized. So there are primary tasks, maybe that's flying the plane, but the secondary tasks matter too, and that's one of the things that were found out. So they have to be prioritized. You have to recognize and report work overloads in both yourself and others. So, some of us suffer from this. We'll just have that kind of attitude of, I'll do it myself and I'll know it's done right. Well, you can't do everything. You have to have trust and faith in other people. Ensure sufficient time for maneuvers and any automated procedures. Communicate changes in the automation and maneuvers. Recognize the distractions caused by automation. And you can become complacent. That's probably the biggest distraction. You just go, oh, well, it's up there. So for those of us who have flown the EBX, which doesn't even have a remote control, it's kind of an interesting concept because it's completely automated. Are we paying attention, or do we start to trust the machine a little too much? And then the knowledge or the ability to take preventative actions before something goes awry. So crew situational awareness. The crew needs to be trained to develop an awareness of operational conditions, contingencies, and risk management. So a lot of training. And if you think about it, the pilot is well trained, but the pilot wants to be a pilot. The rest of the crew may not realize how much they need to be trained in aviation procedures when they initially go into the profession. But everyone needs to be aware. People need to have knowledge of airspace, of what's going on around them, so they can inform the pilot, because the pilot can become overloaded if they're the only one paying attention to these things. You need to understand that situational awareness involves interpretation. So you have to interpret the world going on around you, which can become a complicated endeavor. You have to use your senses and use those senses, and then as information comes in through your senses, evaluate the data and understand it and interpret those situational cues to recognize problems when they're emerging, not when it's too late. And you need to recognize and define a problem, or understanding that problem is the first critical step to making effective and safe decisions. So I want you to commit this idea to memory. detection and correction, detection and correction. When you're out there, and in our world, when we're flying the drones and we're up in the airspace, watch what's going on. Don't say, there's a little bit of a glitch, but let me see if this gets a lot worse. No. Detect, correct. So the first sign of anything, we want you to correct it. Bring the drone down, restart the mission. Because as things kind of look clunky, funky, and things happen, these are computerized flying machines with cameras and a whole lot of radio frequencies, you know how much can go wrong. So the first sign of anything is a problem, and it should be addressed, and then the mission should either begin again, or you can often, and at this point, resume the mission where you left off. All right, so be ready to recognize lost situational awareness. And if you're a member of the crew or the pilot, verbalize your concerns, okay? You have a crew, bounce things off of them if you're the pilot. If you're the crew member and you see something, say something. Stabilize the condition. So once you verbalize the concern, make sure that you're able to kind of stabilize what's going on, and so you can make decisions and keep control, especially of an unmanned aircraft. Brief what's the future impact. At that point, be brief what could happen in the future, and debrief everyone else on the crew when you can. So these are important elements to recognizing the lost situational awareness. Errors in maintaining situational awareness can be as simple as not receiving information, failure to perceive the information through your senses, the inability to comprehend. Let's say you've sensed it, you noticed it, you perceived it, but you don't know what to do then because you don't have training or knowledge, or an inability to control and project future decisions. So as you can see, one of the things about keeping situational awareness and being aware of what's going on is having information, being able to perceive it, process it, communicate it, etc. All right, so what are the causes for the loss of situational awareness? Attention threats. This happens when you allow your awareness to become compromised. You might have too many tasks, or when you fail to monitor the external environment. So if you find yourself with our friends C-3PO and R2-D2, you're probably way off course. So attention matters, attention to detail. And when that attention to detail is threatened, you can lose situational awareness. You can also have task saturation, too many duties to attend to at one time. Number of tasks possible may vary for the individual based on psychological and or physiological state at the current time. So think about this. If you're out there and you're a single person, crew, pilot, RPIC flying your drone, and you're in a very complex flight procedures, you didn't have a visual observer, you really can't, you can see the drone, but you can't see how close you are to things. You're losing perspective. And maybe 100 times you've been able to deal with that. You've been able to do it. But this time, you just didn't feel well when you woke up, and you have some issues going on in your life, and you're not 100%. Well, at that moment, you're not capable, and you've lost your situational awareness. Distraction, not a surprising one, I wouldn't think. And this is the interruption of conscious attention to the task you're doing by non-task related cues. These can be external, noise, lights, beeps. If you're untrained, think about the first time you ever flew like a DJI drone. You may have all of a sudden heard some beeps, but you weren't really well trained and you weren't experienced. You might have watched a video on the remote control and the functions, but the beep, all of a sudden you're getting this beep, and you don't know where somebody has set the battery. So you're like, now you're not paying attention to the drone. You're looking at the screen. You're trying to figure out what's going on, and you crash into the tree, right? So this is kind of the idea. Internal, they could be things like marital issues, financial issues, relationship issues, someone's need for attention, any of these kinds of things. And if you're concentrating on that, you're distracted from what's going on and what you're doing in piloting and flying. remember, these beeps can be good if the instruments are alerting the pilot to an issue, but imagine trying to solve marital problems on a cell phone when piloting and beeps going on and everything else. So this distraction can be an issue. We talked a little bit before about tunnel vision, but here the loss, we might call this channelized detention. So this is when you focus on only a limited number of environmental cues. All right, so you're really looking down that thing. So you can't see everything going on around you because your attention is too focused or over-focused at the time. And this is often found to be one of the biggest performance factors in the loss of situational awareness. Same time, kind of contrary to over-attention or complete attention or too much focus is a lack of conscious effort to monitor the external environment, and that's inattention. Oh, I'm sorry, I was flying my drone, but I needed to get a drink of water, so I just let it hover there, and the plane came upon it. That's you lost your situational awareness. You weren't paying attention. Another one is habituation, and this occurs in high workload situations or changes in operating procedures that you weren't trained on, or just an utter lack of experience. And so, the really inexperienced pilot pays attention. So I often talk about this in terms of schools because I run one. And if we think about it, we have freshmen, we have sophomores, juniors, seniors often. And the freshmen, they have a complete lack of experience, but they're often in education not the biggest problem. They're trying harder. It's that sophomore year. It's that overconfidence that comes upon someone. They know what they're doing, but they become arrogant, complacent. They become overconfident. And that's why the Greek for the word sophomore is wise fool. So for those of you who are in the second year of the program, remember the concept of sophomore and the wise fool. You're probably wise enough and have enough experience to be just foolish enough to take a risk you shouldn't take. So keep that in mind. Another example is that if the same task is done multiple times, so you've done this perpetually, you've done this so many times, you could literally say, oh yeah, I remember doing that. But you needed to do it one more time. But you couldn't keep track of how many times you did it or the appropriate number of times. So that's the concept of habituation. So we have a concept in education called negative transfer. So positive transfer is when we're learning in one context, it improves performance in some other context. So we're able to positively take what we learned and apply it in another place. There is a counter to that, and it's known as negative transfer. And this happens when something is learned so well that it begins to be performed at the subconscious level. Sometimes we call that the rote level. But in a new situation, what you did before doesn't work this time. So it's not as if you learned something, you're applying it, and it's positive, and it's, oh, wow, thank goodness we had this in training because I can apply it here. This is almost the opposite. Oh, I know so much. Oh, but that was the wrong response for this situation. It seemed logical to do that. And that's the idea of negative transfer. Inappropriate motivation. This occurs when motivation is not consistent with the goals of the mission. So what is the motivation of the crew? Is it to just say you did something? Is it to just be there? Is it almost like peer pressure kind of thing? What is the motivation of the individual? And if you're not appropriately motivated, and your motivations are something other than safety, risk mitigation, performance, mission fulfillment, then, that can really impact situational awareness as well. Which brings us to pressing, the placing unnecessary demands on yourself or other crew members beyond the known capabilities or limitations. So, you have to remember, and if you are the remote pilot in command, you have to think about your crew. Don't over ask the newest person to do the most complex tasks. Sometimes people think that way. They think, oh, well, if I just throw them in to the fire, we'll see what happens. Let's see if they get burned. And there may be some contexts where that works. I'd probably argue there aren't. But, in flight, in aviation, in safety, in risk mitigation, that just isn't appropriate. Crew members need to be properly trained for the job they're doing. It's not really an effective learn-on-the-job profession. Imagine that. Go in, okay, today I'm going to be pilot. Never flown one of these before, we'll see how it goes. So think about this concept of pressing. And some peer pressure is good, so I want to keep that in mind. If you have a solid safety culture with systems, procedures, training, and everyone buys into it, the new person will immediately adapt to that. That'll be a positive peer pressure. But an opposite of that is the concept of misdirected peer pressure. And it comes from competitive or aggressive behaviors. So attempting an inappropriate operation because someone dared you to. Or, oh yeah, these are the right regulations. Let me fly this drone. Hand me that beer so you can impress someone. That's a misdirected peer pressure. And there are plenty of examples that you can go online, and if you just want to look at the crash of United 2885, you can see what happens when this occurs. So that's an overview of the nature of crew resource management and of situational awareness. You're welcome to watch the rest of the videos. They're excellent, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. I'm Dr. Will Austin for Warren Community College. Thank you.